Hi there, this is an asynchronous lesson, so it's student paced, and it's going to cover the differences in religiosity amongst social class, age and ethnic groups. And it's going to offer some of the explanations for why we see the different levels of religiosity, particularly amongst working class and middle class people, older and younger people, and then different ethnic groups, particularly within the UK. So let's get started here, and feel free to pause if you need to. You might be watching this through Nearpod as an asynchronous lesson, which might give you opportunities to pause. And if you're watching it through YouTube, then please pause when you need to and skip back if you need to for making notes. So let's start with the kind of traditional view that we've touched on definitely in the course already, that religion is stronger in the working classes. And this is backed up by things like Weber's idea of a theodicy of disprivilege, and the fact that religion kind of plays a part in explaining or soothing disprivilege. And then Marx's opiate for the masses, of course. So we're seeing religion maybe as something that is a comfort to the working classes, and we're viewing them as oppressed. However, what you'll see as we go through this is that there are nuances and differences and exceptions and differences within groups when it comes to social class and religion. So what we've got here is that there is some evidence to suggest that religiosity is in fact higher amongst the middle classes. So there was a survey in 2015 that said 62% of people that go to church are actually middle class. I mean, obviously we can question lots about that. How was the survey done? What did we say was middle class? Did people self-identify? Was it based on economic, characteristics or whatever? But it's a useful figure. So there's a survey from 2015 saying that more churchgoers are middle class, but we've also got this presumption that churchgoers tend to be working class. So there's a range of different explanations for the fact that maybe there are more middle class people going to church. And some of those explanations are to do with social networking, church communities, things that the middle class make use of. And that actually would be a kind of belonging without believing kind of idea, wouldn't it? So it wouldn't mean that there's more faith in the middle classes. It would mean that they are useful or maybe enjoyable communities where networking is built in. So it's not even as simple as kind of working class are more religious, middle class are more religious, because it's broken down even further than that. So in the UK, the Anglican Church tends to be more middle class than the Roman Catholic Church, or the Methodist Church. And so the Anglican Church, maybe because it was more established, it was once described as the Tory party at prayer. So it's kind of linked to the ruling classes. So maybe that's why the Anglican Church is seen that way. Roman Catholic Church, there are explanations as well there in terms of immigration and people that have come from different countries that have got high levels of Catholicism. Also, the Quaker religion is quite middle class, but it's actually politically quite anti-establishment. So that doesn't really fit with being aligned to the ruling classes. So there's lots of things we can unpick and tease out here where we've got these kind of paradoxical or contradicting aspects of social class and religion. So the Roman Catholic Church, as I just said, is more working class, at least in the UK. So more members of the Roman Catholic Church tend to be from working class backgrounds. This might relate to the predominance of migrant communities from very Catholic backgrounds geographically Catholic backgrounds like Eastern Europe, Poland, Ireland, and these groups that have come over and migrated to the UK and therefore brought the Catholic faith with them. So that could be one of the explanations. Also, areas that are traditionally popular with Irish immigrants, large cities like Liverpool, so they possibly have, more of this Catholic membership. So we've got a few different sort of explanations and understandings there. And then when we look at the middle classes, we've also got this sort of general finding from quite a few sociologists that New Age movements tend to attract middle class members. Now, Steve Bruce puts this down to a spiritual thirst that kind of comes from, maybe you don't have to worry about material needs, so your focus isn't on kind of where the next meal is coming from or feeding your children or worrying about paying the bills. So there becomes like a gap a kind of spiritual thirst or a relative deprivation. So there are arguments that consumerism leads to a kind of sense of meaninglessness, and then you look for spirituality. But there's also the argument that once you've fulfilled your kind of material needs, then you look, it's kind of a Maslow's hierarchy thing, and you look for maybe spiritual. So maybe you look for spiritual needs because of the middle class lifestyle and circumstances. So a good way of breaking this down is thinking about social class, we've got in the left column, and then reasons for religiosity. So the kind of incentive to be religious, maybe. So we've got working classes who are actually statistically most likely to be members of denominations, sects, or the Catholic Church in the UK. So we've got a bit of everything there, apart from New Age movements. So we've got theodicy of disprivilege, compensatory promises, but also there is a welfare function still performed by the church, you know, in terms of financial support and general welfare. But there's also a sense of belonging and community, which we could argue is desired by people who maybe feel oppressed or marginalised in their lives. And then moving on to middle class, who are more likely to be members of cults, like, say, Scientology, who actually, you know, really market themselves at people with more money, and New Age movements, but also traditional churches. So we're kind of, there's not really there's not a particular divide here, is there? And the reasons that middle class people may want to be religious, or the explanations we have: spiritual deprivation and relative deprivation, which are very similar, social networking, and also tradition and social desirability. So it could be kind of in norms and values and the way that people want to be seen as a good person. So that is social class and religion. And then we're moving on to talk about age and religion. So this might be a point where you want to skip back to some of the social class and make sure your notes are all intact. And then we're moving on to age and religiosity, and we're looking at the patterns there. So there is a link between age and religion, but it does, excuse the typo there, it does vary between different religions. So we can't kind of say, oh, older people are always more religious. There are differences between different religious groups. So older people tend to be more religious. That's a bit of an ethnocentric view, because it actually applies to Christianity in the UK. So some really useful figures from the 2011 census are that 22% of those identifying as Christian were over 65. Now, that might not sound that unusual, but then when you think only 3.9% of Muslims were over 65, so that's interesting, isn't it? But actually, in contrast, 88% of Muslims were under 50. So you might want to pause and kind of look at that data for a minute and maybe make some notes on that. So we're seeing a lot more younger people who are members of the Islamic religion than younger people who are Christians. So that's a kind of nice evaluation point and a nice comparison that we can bring in. We've then got, and I'm going to try and bring myself out the way here. Here we go. We've got, there are people who said that they had no religious belief in the 2011 census, and they tended to be over 25. So people without religious belief. Brearley found that the average age of churchgoers actually increased between 1979 and 2005. So we could argue that the church population is becoming older, or has an average age that is older now. So if we make this assumption, even if it is quite Eurocentric and particularly Christian focused, but if we sort of say, well, why are churchgoers older, even if it just is in the Christian church and if it is just in the UK, is it because they're more aware of their own mortality? They're getting older. They kind of, there's this suggestion they want to book a place in the afterlife. They start getting older and thinking, I better be more careful. Maybe I should go to church. Possibly. I'm sure there aren't many older people that would admit to that, even if it is true. Religious practice was probably more common when they were young. So they maybe were socialised into believing that religious practice is important, and young people are not getting that same socialisation. That links in with cultural amnesia. It links in with the reduction in church attendance, but also with our busy lifestyles where not everyone is available to do that on a Sunday. Also, religious organisations offer a social life and a support network for people who, as they're older, maybe have lost their partners, or, you know, they're looking to be more engaged and to have that connection. So it might be those kind of coffee mornings and social events and even the services themselves, and they're drawn to the community so that they have a way of connecting. So they are your possible reasons that it's argued that people who go to church are older. So let's have a look here at why younger people may be less religious. So we focused on the reason that older people may be drawn to religion, but why might younger people not be drawn to religion? So religious institutions, particularly traditional ones, could be seen as unattractive or boring in today's society that is far more diverse, far more fast-paced, far more consumerist. There's also greater competition. There's more available. You know, if you grew up in a time where Christianity was really what everybody did, and then you wouldn't question it. But now there's so much more available in terms of different things you can do, pursuits, hobbies, spiritual paths, all sorts. But also there's this whole spiritual marketplace, isn't there? So you don't just have the church available as a young person who wants to seek some spiritual guidance or be connected with some kind of spiritual path. But there's also all of these new age movements and different kind of groups and things that you can be involved in. And also we could argue that globalization and technology have played a part in that, because now we can actually find out about more, even if they're not on our doorstep or in our locality, we can still find out about all of these different groups and things that we can belong to, and we can belong online and we can join communities online as well. So there's a huge amount of diversity and competition now for young people. Now, Durkheim talked about the sacred and the profane, and he saw the sacred as things that are religious. But for many young people, if you think about kind of hyper reality and postmodern society, many young people might hold secular, non-religious heroes and symbols as sacred. So it may be everything from gurus, footballers, people who kind of give wisdom, life coaching, that kind of thing. So, you know, entrepreneurs, really successful people, we've got all these self-help books and things, haven't we? And guides on how to make your life amazing. Young women can go and, you know, learn from Michelle Obama. And, you know, people might go and learn from kind of Steve Jobs and read these autobiographies and get all this advice. So actually there are other sacred kind of, if you take sacred with that definition, there are other sacred heroes who might be followed. So we still may have sacred and profane, but the sacred may have now been secularized, possibly. So it's a nice argument there. A lot of these ideas that we're looking at here were outlined by Voas and Crockett, because in a lot of their writing, they talk about why young people are less religious, and they've got some ideas on that from their findings. So there's also this idea of vitalizing. So what Bruce points out is that he thinks that there's this decline in religious education. So we're not kind of socializing the next generation. So there was a point where almost everybody, or at least over half of UK children, went to Sunday school. So obviously the vitalising and the socialisation was happening to over half of the population. Now it's actually really rare that people go to Sunday school, and it's so rare that actually Steve Bruce predicted that there would be no Sunday schools left by 2016. Now, there are still some left, so that prediction didn't really come true, but it still shows how serious the decline is. And what Bruce compares it to, he says, even though there was a revival of faith schools, so in the 1990s and 2000s, there were more faith schools that got opened up, still we haven't seen as many Sunday schools. So we could kind of argue, is there more religious socialization because there are more faith schools now because of that revival? But Sunday schools have decreased. So has it kind of gone, faith schools might have gone up, but Sunday schools have gone down. So, you know, is all of this contributing? And it is, according to Steve Bruce, is contributing to the fact that there is less religious socialization. And that possibly is leading to this kind of cultural amnesia that Hervé Léger talks about. So we've also got Lynch. That's quite a useful study to throw in. You know, we use Steve Bruce a lot, don't we? He's had so much to say. Lynch is kind of more of a standalone, just for this example. But Lynch found that young people might actually find some functions of religion through other subcultures that maybe wouldn't have existed 100 years ago. So sport, celebrity culture, popular music, being part of sort of music-focused identity groups and that kind of thing. And that some of those things will now perform the function that religion would have done back in a different society, you know, maybe 100 years ago. Church census findings give us a bit of a more complex picture, because they show that children are one of the groups that have really high church attendance. And then in teenage years, they stop, and then it builds back up as they get into late middle age. So as they get kind of old. So as people get into late middle age, they tend to become more religious again. But there's this real gap in the middle where it declines. However, we can evaluate that, because just because children are going to church doesn't mean they're religious. It's usually because their parents are taking them along and making them go to church. So it's not a kind of free will act, is it, going to church as a child? And then what really found as well is that the age group with the lowest church attendance was age 15 to 19. So clearly teenagers are generally not engaging with traditional religion. So we've got quite a lot of interesting information in here, and you don't have to know every single one of these statistics at all. It's just about making sure you have enough to create a balanced argument about age, about gender, about social class, and about ethnicity. Because it may be you get an essay on any of those individually, or you may have an essay that says social groups and the variations of religiosity, in which case you'd want to bring all of these in. Okay, so outside of traditional churches, we can look at sects. Sects often appeal to young adults for lots of reasons. Some of the similar reasons that they appeal to the working class. It could be kind of marginalisation. It could be a dissatisfaction with society. And it could be, and they appeal to women sometimes for that reason as well. But it might also be that young people are able to make the commitment to sex because they haven't got a kind of family, children, mortgage and all that. So they can just up and go and belong to something that actually requires quite a lot of commitment. These sects can offer companionship and community and a sense of belonging. They might also have these radical and counterculture ideas that have developed from, from other aspects of our culture. So therefore, young people may be really drawn to that because they may have this kind of sense of dissatisfaction about the materialistic world not being all they thought it would be once they'd kind of graduated. Also, young people are freer to make the commitment, aren't they? Which obviously changes as people get older. Also, the same may be true of some New Age movements and cults. Although generally New Age movements and cults tend to particularly appeal to middle-aged, middle-class women. But we can see the age and the class differences all kind of interplaying there. So we can evaluate the patterns in age and belief. One of our evaluations that you can have as your however at the end of a paragraph is that it's actually really hard to judge the census data, because particularly there was a period not that long ago where it was kind of fashionable to put comedy religions in the census, so things like Jedi, heavy metal as your religion. And that then distorted the whole kind of idea of are people religious or not. So that made the census data a little bit problematic. There are also people who identify as Christian, but they don't practice or have any Christian knowledge, like some of the studies we've looked at where people didn't know anything about the life of Jesus, but they still called themselves Christian. So actually what happens is sometimes these become labels of, and the sentence hasn't been finished there, you can see, they become labels of ethnicity, not actually of faith. That's what that word should say there. So they become labels of ethnicity, not necessarily faith. So people kind of go, oh, well, I'm white British, therefore I'm going to call myself a Christian. But actually, are they a practicing Christian or not? And are they far less religious than a Christian would have been maybe 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Also, we can question the data on the Muslim community. It might be questionable according to some sociologists, because actually religious faith and observance is seen as very important in Muslim families. So are people kind of doing it through a sense of expectation? But then we could also argue that that doesn't mean that they're not religious. So it's just kind of an evaluation that we can question, although we're not making any assumptions about any groups at all. So if you're writing an essay on age and religiosity, some of the things you might include as your kind of paragraphs and things that you want to weigh up might include issues of the elderly being closer to the end of life, like we talked about, and the impact of spirituality there. The elderly maybe being more lonely, and young people being more susceptible to secularization, and therefore that's why young people are less religious. The young may have cultural amnesia because they haven't been socialized into church as people maybe would have been several years ago, many years ago. So also the young, we've got this argument again that young are exposed to the whole spiritual supermarket, and that can make it, you know, difficult or not even necessary to stick with one religion. Can be influenced by a whole range of other factors such as music and drugs and sports and things that can replace spirituality. There's also the impact of the private sphere. So religion can happen at home. Young people may be more susceptible to this kind of like chat rooms and things where they might not, you know, they may find other types of religion. There may be other things that they can do, and children may spend less time in the private sphere, or there may be less religion happening at home. And also some young people, that's another evaluation, is some young people, particularly those from a Pakistani and Bengali background, are really religious. So we can't say that young people generally are not religious. It's just that we have that argument, you know, for some groups. So on to ethnicity. So we're going to have a look at why certain ethnic groups tend to be more religious than others. So here I've got some data for you. What I would like you to do is press pause here and have a look at what you think are the most interesting figures here. So have a look and try and pick out 3 figures that you think are really interesting. So press pause now. Okay, so I've had a look myself, and I think the most interesting figures here are the number of white people in the UK saying that they're Christian, the number of black or black British people saying that they are Christian, and thinking, oh, they're quite high figures, aren't they? So actually 75% of people said that they were Christian in 2011. That's really high, isn't it? Although that's people just saying it for the census. That's not necessarily people going to church or doing anything about it. But when we compare that to the number of Pakistani and Bengali people in the UK saying that they are religious, it's, you know, 9 out of 10 people. It's more than 9 out of 10 people. It's almost everybody. So that's a real comparison, isn't it? So a lot of people in the census saying they're religious, saying they're Christian, particularly white British people. But when we compare that with Islam, we're seeing much higher levels of religiosity. So that's something you can bring in as a point. You know, we do have these ethnic variations. One of the groups within Britain are Pakistani and Bengali communities who tend to show very, very strong and high amounts of religiosity. So here we've got, let me move myself over there. We've got some evidence from Madood. And Madood tells us, so this is from 1997, reasonably recent. And Madood is telling us that 11% of white members in the Church of England saw religion as important in their lives. Now just go back and compare that with the 75% of white members of the UK who said that they were Christian. 11% saw religion as something very important in their life. That's 1 in 10 people. It's not very much. 71% of Caribbean members of new Protestant churches, so these kind of new religious movements, Baptist, Methodist churches, Pentecostalism, 71% of them said religion is important in their life. It's quite different, isn't it, to 11%. 43% of Hindus said religion was important in their life, but 74% of Muslims said that religion is important in their life. So that's quite obvious, isn't it? So if we talk about importance of religion and people identifying it from Madood's study, identifying as how important religion is to them, then we've got a real variation by ethnicity. And in a moment, we'll look at some of the possible reasons for that. Also, what Madood found out was that people from ethnic minority groups were all more likely to attend the actual places of worship. So people from Pakistani, Bengali backgrounds, people from Black Caribbean backgrounds, more likely to go to church or to go to the mosque. Whereas white British people were less likely, even if they identified as religious, less likely to actually attend those places of worship. Okay, so we've also got John Bird, who gives us a kind of, you don't have to memorize these 5 reasons and you don't have to necessarily name them all, but they're kind of useful to be aware of. And some of them link in with other theorist ideas as well. So John Bird said, first one, and these are reasons why ethnic minority groups tend to be more religious. He said that many members come from societies where religion is high. Community and solidarity, if you're a member of an ethnic minority group. Now that fits in with Steve Bruce's ideas of cultural transition and cultural defence, but also in some cultures, religion also provides the function of introducing people to future partners for marriage. So there's another function there, isn't there? If we're thinking about kind of that structural differentiation and kind of stepping away, not having so many functions fulfilled by religion. In some religions, there are more functions than others. A way of maintaining cultural identity and tradition. So again, that's a kind of cultural transition or a cultural defence, cultural transition really. Also socialisation tends to be stronger in other religions. Therefore, there is a kind of expectation of children to be part of the religious practice, and then it naturally keeps vitalising. And also religious beliefs can be a way to cope with oppression or racism or marginalisation in society for those groups. So that is a cultural defence argument, as Steve Bruce would also give us. So here we are with Steve Bruce. Let's see if I can move out of the way a little bit more. Where shall I go? Here we are. Okay, so Steve Bruce does accept, he says, yeah, ethnic minority groups are more religious than white people in modern society, but he believes it's about community, not about religious commitment. I'm sure there are plenty of people that would disagree with him here, particularly religious, you know, British Muslims within the UK. But this is what he really feels. So he's saying it's not about religious belief, it's about the community. So he talks about, and we've talked about this before, so I'll go through this quite quickly and just touch on it, but cultural defence as a protection of identity in a hostile environment or defence against racism kind of creates those tighter communities in response to the kind of isolation maybe from outside or prejudice. And cultural transition, the idea of coping with migration. So you move somewhere that's completely new. We saw this a lot in America as well, when there were big swathes of migration a long time ago. So the idea of finding a community when you're in a new place. Now, the thing with cultural transition is, if that's true, once people have found their place, it should wear off after the next generation. And we have got studies where that doesn't look like it's happening. So it's kind of a problematic theory, cultural transition. But that's great because you get to say, however, and it gives you your evaluation. So Bruce also believes, so he thinks over time, the secularisation of the UK will rub off on ethnic groups. So Madood thinks this, Bruce thinks this. They think that over time, ethnic groups are going to become less religious because they kind of have this effect of the society around them that is less religious, and their country as a whole that's more secular. Madood found that some groups are showing a decline in second generation. So he found, and if I just, oh, sorry, let me go back one. And if I just move myself out of the way so you can see, here we go. So Madood found that Chinese and Afro-Caribbean ethnic groups seem to have less religiosity going into second generation after migrating, but he did find that Muslim community were an exception to this, and they didn't apply to that rule, so they still maintain their religion even with second, third generation. Okay, now also useful here when we're talking about Muslim communities and maintaining their religion, we have got Yvonne Haddad. And Yvonne Haddad is really, really helpful study because she's great as a however. Yvonne Haddad found this, Haddad 2007. Her studies found that after 9/11, the hijab has actually become a really important icon of identity for young American Muslims, and presumably applying the same to young British Muslims. So there are daughters that she found who were more likely to wear a hijab, even if their mother doesn't. So there's an argument there that people are becoming, in the Muslim community, are becoming more religious as the generations go on, which criticises what Bruce and Madood were saying just now. So this is a really nice evaluation for an increase in religiosity in ethnic groups rather than this kind of dying out of religion or secular. And finally, there's just an offer of some extra reading here. So this is a really interesting paper. It's nicely written. It's easy to read. It's by Bruce and Voas. So you know Voas from Voas and Crockett. You know Bruce because he talks about religion on like every topic area that we look at. And they've got some interesting arguments, and there's some graphs and data and things in here that I think you'll find really interesting. If you don't want to have to type out that lengthy link, then drop me a line and I can send you the link that will be clickable. So that is all from me for today. So you've looked at social class, class, you've looked at age, and you've looked at ethnicity and the differentials and the possible explanations for those in terms of levels of religiosity. If you need to go back and revisit anything in order to make notes, then please do. Any questions, please bring them to class, or put them in the chat when we're in the live lesson, and make sure you note them down so that you do ask those questions. And we will then move on to practicing, doing some paragraph practice with this, some evaluation practice, essay planning practice, and then we'll look at knowledge organisers as well. So don't worry, we will consolidate, but hopefully this will bring you to the next lesson with a really good set of notes and a good understanding. So well done.